This week's video is sponsored by MPB. In this video, I'm going to take a close look on the Tamron 50-400mm telephoto zoom lens. Since I am a landscape photographer and borrowed this lens for my trip to the Arctic, I'll share my review based on my experiences shooting both landscapes and wildlife while visiting the incredible archipelago of Svalbard. Of the many lenses that are now available for Sony full frame, the 50-400mm from Tamron is definitely one of the lenses I've had my looks on the most. It may be the worst nightmare for James Popsies.
Get that away from me.
However, for me it may be that one godsend lens that can reduce my kit from 3 lenses to only 2 lenses, where I cover everything from 16mm all the way to 400mm. I will of course discuss the image quality of the lens and compare it to my Sony 100-400 because that is the main competitor of this lens. However, to be fair to both lenses, I will test them out in a real world scenario, not in some indoor, highly controlled, almost scientific scenario, because in all honesty, I want to know how this lens works practically and not how it works in theory. Also, a big thanks to mbp.com for loaning me this lens. They have also been so nice as to sponsor this week's video. So mbp.com is a platform where you can sell and buy used camera gear. So if you have a piece of gear you haven't used for many years, you can sell it there. And if you want to save a little bit of money and buy some used gear instead of completely new gear, you can also do it there. I didn't know that MPB actually also works in continental Europe and not just Britain and the US. So that gives you just an even bigger market to sell and buy used camera gear, and the entire process is simple and hassle-free. MPB will even give you a price for the piece of gear before they arrange for a courier, and once they've inspected what you want to sell, they'll even update the price if it's worth more. If you choose to buy a used piece of gear through them, they even include a 6 months guarantee. There is a link in the description of the video I'd highly appreciate if you want to sell or buy some used camera gear. But without further ado, let's get out into the field and actually take some photos. So we have made it to the top of this little hill right here. And you see here in the background a big, beautiful landscape. So you can see all the way down there, there is Silver Earl, our ferry. And we came ashore here and walked up here and then all the way up to this hill. And as you can see, I have my 50-400mm on. I've generally only been hand holding this. I'm only having it on a tripod for you to see it here. And I gotta admit, the versatility of this lens is just ridiculous. As you can see here on the B-roll, there's a little bit of foreground. And when I zoom in, I just can keep zooming in and in and in and in. So from 50mm all the way to 400mm. And I can zoom back out again. So while walking up here, we saw reindeer, which was super easy to photograph with this lens. I could get the big wide view, but I could also zoom into the individual reindeer and photograph those, film them, and I could also photograph back towards the small boats in the fjord. And I could also photograph some of the guides here against the big epic mountain scenes. So far so good. I'm really satisfied with trying out the Tamron 50-400mm lens. There is no doubt that the 50-400mm is a very versatile lens, and having those extra 50mm in the wide end compared to a 100-400mm lens makes quite a big difference, as you can see here where I compare the field of view you get between 50mm, 100mm and 400mm. So it was just announced that we have seen our first furry friend, our first sighting of a polar bear, which is of course very exciting, traveling around here in Svalbard. So this afternoon we were supposed to go out on a hike, so Zodiac onto land, and then we were supposed to hike the island right here in front of us. However, a polar bear was sighted and it has been like moving all along here. I've seen it grab a few chicks. As you can see here on the B-roll, it just wants some food. This guy is definitely not going extinct because he seems to have found a little bit of food. So in regard to the gear, this is where I just had to pull out the 100 to 400 millimeter from Sony, simply just because that is where I have a 2x extender. The 2x extender does not work with the Tamron 50 to 400, and that is kind of a downside to it. So if you really need to do this kind of wildlife photography, you either need this or a really dedicated wildlife photography lens, because even at 800 millimeter, as you can see on these photos, the bear is just so far away. There's no chance that I'm actually getting a really good photo from that. The 2x extender plus the 100 to 400, as you can see when I zoom in here, the quality of the photos, they're a little bit lacking, to say the least. But I did manage to capture something. However, it was just not with the 50 to 400. That was just a bit impossible. Okay, so hold that thought. As you can see, the photos I got with the 100 to 400 millimeter plus the 2x extender at 800 millimeter is quite lacking in image quality. Actually so much that it would probably just have been better to photograph the bear without the 2x extender and then crop in. So not being able to use the 2x extender on the Tamron 50 to 400 is actually only relevant for videography, as the video I recorded having the 2x extender on is better than if I would have cropped to 1080p from the 4K video. Unless you view this on a small phone, of course, then it doesn't matter at all. We went into the Zodiacs and approached the island where the bear had decided to take a rest. There are very strict guidelines on how to approach a polar bear. You're supposed to approach it slowly and calmly and obviously keep your distance. The point is to not disturb the bear's natural behavior. Bears are not necessarily afraid of humans. After all, it's the alpha predator in the area, and they can be quite curious about what those monkeys in small boats are doing. The optimal approach is if it doesn't really care about you, and if it starts to move away because of your presence, it's a big no-no to chase it. This guy didn't really seem to care much and only occasionally looked up to take minimal notice of us. Being in a Zodiac and trying to photograph and film a polar bear with an 800mm focal length was comically hard, even with image stabilization on, but with a very fast shutter speed and perfect timing, I managed to capture this photo. Our best theory for what we think is a stain of blood in its forehead was an attack by a skurva, a big aggressive gull-like bird. And no, this is by no means a particularly interesting polar bear photo. Zooming in, the photo is a tiny bit soft due to the extender, and even with the extender photographed at 800mm, I still had to crop the photo quite a lot. After this experience, I decided to just skip the 100 to 400mm and 2x converter setup and stick to the 50 to 400mm for the rest of the trip. The versatility of the Tamron lens definitely outweighed any small advantages of the 100 to 400mm. That said, it was only very few of my favorite photos from the Svalbard part of the trip that was taken below 100mm, and they all falls into the minimalist or landscape photography category. On our last Zodiac trip in Svalbard, a colony of about 30 walruses was spotted, so we went to photograph that. The walruses were somewhere between not bothered and mildly curious about our presence, and like the polar bear, it's important to let them decide whether they want to come closer. Luckily they did, and I got these two portraits of a big male taken at 240mm with the Tamron 50 to 400. What a scar this guy has. Suddenly, over the radio, our scouts reported having spotted a polar bear on a nearby island, so we went into line and sailed over to see if the bear was more interested in posing for us, and luckily he was. How about that? Perfectly placed with the dark clouds behind and the sun to backlit him from above. Yes, thank you. If you want to learn more about how I think composition, be sure to get my 2 ebooks on exactly that topic. Here I cover different compositional tools, not rules, such as balance, central or off-central compositions, horizontal or vertical formats, visual flow, and much more. They're very easy to read and has loads of examples. And there are links to both of them down in the description of the video. How was that, Nigel?
That was unbelievable. It's so exciting when you see a polar bear like that. It was a male, I think, but it was wow. And he just stood just there, like posed for us, looking at us. Incredible, really good.
James?
Top 5 moments with a camera, I'd say. Definitely.
The polar bear didn't stay around for long, and as it seemed he wasn't interested in our company, we pulled back to the walruses. However, to our huge surprise and excitement, after only a few minutes the polar bear came swimming onto the island with the walruses where we were placed. He went up onto land and slowly crawled up to a vantage point where I got my favorite polar bear photo from Svalbard. This photo just looks so cool. Super minimal and dark, and then you just have that polar bear sticking its head out. Awesome. Zooming into the polar bear, you can also see that he is nice and sharp. So back to what I've learned about the Tamron 50-400mm, having used it for some days in Svalbard. So the Tamron 50-400 does not come with a lens collar and a lens foot. However, you can buy it separately. If you do have one of these collars that attach to the camera, then you actually can get almost the same effect where you push the center of gravity of your setup a little bit back. It's not as good as a dedicated lens collar and setup. However, this one for me has done decently well on this trip here. And the bonus is that you of course only have to deal with one of these and not several, so you can just change lenses as much as you want while you have your camera on the tripod. One of the benefits of the Sony over the Tamron is that the Sony has a slightly faster aperture as it goes from f4.5 in the wide end to f5.6 in the long end. The Tamron 50-400 goes from f4.5 in the wide end, f5.6 at 100mm and f6.3 at the longest end. But for landscape photography, that's usually a non-issue as we never shoot wide open. For wildlife photography, it may be another story, but I'm not an expert in that regard. I found that stopping down a bit delivered the best results. The lens does come with image stabilization, but it's notoriously a hard topic to talk about as it is rather individual. We all shake our bodies different, so I may be able to keep the lens steady at 1/10 of a second, while others won't be able to. So saying something specific is hard. Here you can see some comparisons where I'm hand-holding the lens while filming. On the left I have active stabilization turned on. This is a feature in the Sony a7R5 with better stabilization, but it comes with the cost of a slight crop. On the right I have the standard image stabilization. I'd say this lens and camera combination is pretty good all the way up to 400mm where it starts to struggle a bit. For landscape photography the image stabilization is generally great and it does what it's supposed to, stabilize the image. But I do find that the native Sony 100-400mm is a bit better in that regard. However, when doing landscape photography in a forest or in darker conditions like the blue hour, you're probably photographing from a tripod anyway. The lens feels great in the hand, and although the Tamron 50-400 does not have a ring to adjust the smoothness of the zoom ring, I'd actually argue it feels better than my Sony 100-400. But, and this is a massive but, In my experience, you will very fast adjust to whatever gear you use and not think further about it. It's not like I was thinking, I wish this lens zoomed or felt like the Sony when I used it. Autofocus is a thing I'm having a bit of a hard time discussing as I'm not a wildlife photographer. For landscape photography, I usually back-bottom focus with spot focus, and it's a way slower process than anything wildlife. With the wildlife focus priority setting activated, my Sony a7R5 was great at locking onto the eyes of the wildlife, and I only got very few misses. Even when photographing the fast Arctic turns, and I used a wide focus area, continuous focus, and wildlife focus priority, it was very good at locking onto the birds. When several birds were in the frame, it could be a bit confused though, but I guess that's what spot active tracking is for. The lens and camera combination was also good at locking onto the guillemots I photographed in last week's video and even get the eyes in focus. If you're a wildlife photographer, you're probably better off finding a dedicated review for wildlife photography for this lens. I have seen one video where it was recommended to update the firmware for better autofocus, which I did before leaving home, so I don't have a comparison to the earlier firmware versions. So finally on to image quality, and I can report that it is great. If you want a very thorough controlled test of image quality, I'd recommend to watch Dustin Abbott's final review on the 50-400mm lens. If you know me, sharpness isn't something I spend a whole lot of time bothering about, at least until a certain threshold. As long as a lens is sharp enough and doesn't wildly distort a photo or smudge out the edges, it's fine. As you can see in this example where we are zoomed in beyond 100%, there is a lot of atmospheric distortion due to a mix of cold and warm air. Atmospheric distortion manifests in how the foreground cliffs looks a bit smeared out. Likewise, in the background glacier, the lines are distorted. No matter how sharp a lens you have, it'll never fix the light actually hitting the lens. So when taking photos of distant objects, keep this in mind. For objects close to you, like a bird, you'll likely place it in the middle of the frame where the lens is the most sharpest, and any potential foreground or background will be out of focus. So in those parts of the photo, the lens sharpness isn't really relevant either. If we zoom into this bird photo, you can see it's quite sharp, and in this day and age with the new AI noise removal tool in Lightroom and Camera Raw, it's almost ridiculous how much image quality you can restore. In this funny photo where a couple of birds are doing some karate, you can see the lens also produce some chromatic aberration, but that is easily fixed in post-processing with a click of a button too. Fringing can also be an issue, but then you just use the defringe tool. You may have to just mingle a bit with the sliders. And although I have run this photo through the AI denoise, the birds are still a tiny bit soft, but that's a combination of the photo being cropped quite heavily and I'm photographing wide open at 400mm. So as you can see in this example, I have stopped down to f9 and you can see the puffin is quite a lot sharper even though I am zoomed way in. That is also something I have learned, which just confirms the general rule of thumb. As mentioned earlier, by stopping a little bit down, you get a sharper image. However, what I did find to be an issue or an annoyance is the vignette problem I have referred to in past videos from telephoto zoom lenses. The Tamron 50-400mm isn't immune to this either. How severe this effect is depends on a combination of the aperture setting and focal length, and is unique from lens model to lens model. When I click the lens profile correction on and off, you can see how the vignette is rather strong, and yes, I can compensate for the darkness of the vignette, but if you look closely, you can see the vignette is also changing the color of the photo. Here the edges are cooler compared to the middle, and the heavier you edit a photo, the more visible it gets. It can be compensated for in post-processing, but it really is an annoyance. It is usually also something you will see in relatively uniform photos without a lot of texture. So if you photograph in more complex environments like a forest, it's probably not something you will see unless you use a lot of dehazing and contrast. So these here are also some editing tips that I cover in my big Photoshop for Landscape Photographers post-processing course. So if you want to learn how I edit my photos from start to finish and all the techniques I use, you should definitely look into enrolling in my Photoshop for Landscape Photographers post-processing course. There is a coupon code down in the description of the video where you can save a little bit of money. So to conclude, I have really enjoyed using the Tamron 50 to 400mm, and having those extra 50mm in the wide end I find to be very valuable. I can definitely see myself getting this lens and just combining it with a 16 to 35mm and then just have 2 lenses to carry around. My only concern is the vignetting and the miscoloring, but as mentioned, this is hard to avoid on any other lenses too. With a substantially lower price tag than the Sony 100 to 400, I can, as a landscape photographer, definitely recommend this lens for landscape photography. For wildlife photography, it's great, but if you're serious about it, I would not rely on this lens to be your longest nor your fastest. So this means I may actually have to just keep this lens for myself. In case you'd like to get a lens like this or any other piece of gear, be sure to use my link to MPB down in the description of the video. Doing so, you support me by showing MPB that it's worth for them to sponsor my videos, which in turn means I can earn a living from making these completely free videos with information to you. If you want to learn more about composition or editing, be sure to get my ebooks or enroll in my post-processing course. And if you benefited from this video, I'd highly appreciate a like, and be sure to subscribe if you want to learn even more about landscape photography.